All right, guys, so in this video, I want to talk about JavaScript promises, which a lot of people I've seen become really intimidated about JavaScript promises, when in reality, it's actually kind of a simple concept to understand if you understand the fundamentals of JavaScript and programming in general. If you are kind of new to programming, then yeah, promises are going to be very confusing to you. But if you have a well-established foundation in the language and you understand how to program, and you understand the basic concepts such as object-oriented programming and how functions work, and a couple of buzzwords that I'm going to go over in this video, then you will have absolutely no problem understanding promises. In fact, if you've done programming in JavaScript, you've probably used promises, and if you didn't understand what you were doing, by the end of this video, you will understand what was going on. So let's go ahead and get started talking about this. So the concept of promises is very simple. A promise is just an object. Well, it's a class. And you can create objects of the promise class. If you understand object-oriented programming, you understand exactly what I mean by that. If you don't yet fully understand object-oriented programming, you really need to go study that first in order to really move forward and become like a better developer in general. So I will put a link in the description for you to get started on learning and getting your head around object-oriented programming. But anyway, you can create a promise object, and the idea is that you will have some sort of asynchronous action. Now, that is the first buzzword, asynchronous programming. Now, asynchronous programming is very simple to understand. Again, don't let these terms scare you. The idea is that sometimes in JavaScript, you're going to run code that isn't going to complete instantly. For example, let's say you want to go get some data from a website. Let's say you want to get some JSON from a website. Well, the time it takes to make that HTTP request and then get the response is asynchronous. You don't exactly know when it's going to finish, and it could take some amount of time. So it's not going to run synchronously. It's going to wait for that response, and then you can run some code afterwards. That is asynchronous programming. So there is some sort of asynchronous action, such as getting data from a database. Now, what happens when that finishes? How do you run code when that code completes? Well, Promises helps you with that, and it also gives us a lot of other features that are really great with asynchronous programming in general. So basically, to put this in English, Promises are a class you can create objects of this promise class that will help you with asynchronous programming. Another buzzword that we kind of need to get out of the way is a callback function, which is just literally a function that you call when something completes. So you can pass in a function to a function, and when some code is done, that function can call that callback function. So that was the original way of handling asynchronous programming. You could pass in a function to another function, and when that code completes, it will call that callback function, thus kind of handling a little bit of the problems of asynchronous programming. But there were problems that promises solve that callback functions weren't very good at doing, one of which was error handling. And let's go ahead and just stop talking about it and get into some code. So if you want to code along with me, you absolutely can. The environment that I have set up is I have a PowerShell window. I'm using Windows. If you're using Mac, you'll likely be using a bash window. And I am in the directory where my code lives, which for me is desktop/promises. And I'm going to be using Node.js to run my code. So if I were to say come into my script.js file, which I just created, I can just say console.log. I do the code, and then when I save it and come in here, I can just run node script.js, and when I press enter, it runs the code. Now, if you don't know how to get Node.js set up, I have a video for that, which I will link in the description below. Once you've finished that, let's go ahead and move forward. So I'm going to clear my console and kind of talk about what promises look like. So you already understand the basic concept of promises, what they solve. There is some sort of asynchronous action, okay? So what is the asynchronous action? That can be anything. It can be any action that will not run synchronously. It is any action such as waiting for a button to be clicked, or waiting for some amount of time to complete, or waiting for an HTTP request to go out and come back. Any code that's going to take some amount of time where it's going to essentially complete in the future. You're going to call it and then it's going to complete in the future instead of completing immediately. Promises, again, give us a interface to be able to work with that sort of code very easily. Promises are a class, so you can create an object of the promise class. So let's go ahead and create a promise from scratch right now. Let's say const the promise is equal to a new promise. So if you're familiar with OOP, then you understand the syntax so far. And now we have a promise. Let's go ahead and log this promise. Let's say console.log the promise. Let's see what the output is when I run this in Node.js. Okay, so it says promise resolver undefined is not a function. And the reason why is because in the promise constructor, it requires an argument and it's a function. So let's go ahead and take a look at this function. So I'm using ES6 function syntax here, or arrow syntax, my apologies. And this function that you pass in as a parameter takes two arguments. It takes resolve and reject. And we can get into that in a second, but now I want to go ahead and log the promise just to show that it's not gonna break us anymore. So I log this, and now you can see it says promise pending, which means that now we have successfully created a promise object. But it says pending, which means that it's not completed yet. It's still pending the completion of this so-called asynchronous code, which we actually didn't really do anything with this promise. We just created a raw promise that will never do anything. So let's go ahead and make it do some stuff. So what does resolve and reject mean? Well, resolve means if the code inside of this promise succeeds, we can call resolve and pass it some data. If it fails, we can call reject and pass it some data. So let's do resolve. Let's say resolve true. Or actually, let's do something a little bit more fun. Let's say apples. So let's resolve apples. Console.log the promise. Now, if I run this code, you can see now it says promise apples. That is because we're instantly resolving with apples. Now, what happens if I reject apples? And I run this. Now it's saying unhandled promise rejection warning. In other words, we are failing. There is an unhandled error that's happening inside of our code. Promises give us a really easy way to both handle the success of a promise and also the failure of a promise. So let's go ahead and talk about this. And for this code example, I want to use actual asynchronous code, and there happens to be a website called JSON Placeholder, which allows us to make HTTP requests to this website, and it will return JSON for us, and we don't have to sign up for anything. It's really great. Thank you so much to the people who developed this. This is an amazing tool. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So all we need to do is call fetch on this URL, and it will give us the JSON. Now, have a look at this fetch function. If you've been using JavaScript for a while, you're very likely have run into the fetch function. Now, interestingly enough, calling fetch with a URL returns a promise. And this .then, you're calling then on the promise that fetch returns. So this is a perfect example of a promise. So fetch returns a promise, and then you're calling then on that promise. Now remember, promise is an object. Objects have functions, or methods as we call them, and then is a function or method of the promise object. So what we're really doing is we're calling then on the promise object that this fetch returns. Now, if that's confusing to you, don't worry, we're gonna put this into practice right now. So instead of creating a promise from scratch, which we'll get a little bit more into creating promises from scratch in a moment, instead I wanna use fetch to call this URL, which will return a promise. And I'm gonna set this to a variable. I'm gonna call it the promise. So the promise is equal to fetch and then this URL. So I wanna go ahead and log this promise. I wanna see what this looks like when I log it. So I'm gonna clear my console and run this code again. This says fetch is not defined. And the reason why is because fetch is actually part of a library that the web browsers use. So we need to actually run this in the context of a web browser in order for this to work. There are other libraries such as Axios, for instance, where you can run this in Node.js, but we're gonna go ahead and translate this over to a HTML document where we then run the JavaScript inside of the web browser starting now so that we can actually use the fetch API. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna right click and click new file and create an index.html file. And then I'm just gonna create my basic HTML skeleton, and I'm going to introduce the script tag with a source of script.js. So I'm just importing the script file that I was just running a moment ago inside of Node.js, but now I'm no longer going to be using Node.js for this. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this window, and now we're going to be opening this inside of a web browser, and I have an extension called Live Server, which you can easily get by clicking, if you have VS Code, by clicking over here on extensions and typing in Live Server, and then installing it. It's very simple. And with this, you can right click on your index.html file with your script tag already referenced, right click on it and click open with Live Server, and it will open a web browser window with a live server running serving your index.html file. And when I click inspect, I can go to my console and see that it's trying to, it goes ahead and actually logs that promise. So it's running the JavaScript that we just wrote. Now, if we look here, the promise that I logged, it says it's been resolved, but that's great, but we have a resolved promise, but nothing's happening. How can we do something with the data that we're getting from JSON placeholder? Well, that's what this .then is for. Then is the code that you want to run when the asynchronous action successfully completes. So what I want to do is create a .then on my promise. That way I can sort of like do some stuff instead of just logging it. So let's actually take a look at what that looks like. So now we have the promise, right? But we need to call then on it because we want to do some stuff when the promise is successful. So I'm going to say the promise.then. Now what then takes is a function, and it takes a function that you want to run as soon as it succeeds. Now I use the arrow syntax here, the ES6 arrow syntax, to create a function just like that. And anything in between these curly braces is the code that I want to run once this succeeds. But this function actually takes an argument. The promise passes this argument to this function automatically, and I'm going to call it data, just because it's easy to understand. Data is what I'm going to call this, but you can literally call this anything in the world. You just call it whatever you want, as long as it follows the basic JavaScript variable syntax. But I'm going to call it data. And then inside of here, I'm going to console.log data. So I'm going to save it. And now let's see what we have. So now we have the response. We're logging the response. This is great. So now we have this readable stream, and we can access the data that we've retrieved from JSON placeholder. So let's take a look here. We're calling fetch. Fetch takes a URL, and it returns a promise. The asynchronous action here is the HTTP request. It goes out and it gets the data and it comes back. And when it comes back successfully, it runs this function that we're passing to then. Then this data variable is the data, the success that's passed in. Now let me show you what this looks like in the context of creating a promise from scratch. Keep in mind that when we create a promise, it takes two variables. It takes resolve and reject into the function that you pass it. Well, in this case, when whatever fetch is doing in the background, you don't have to worry about this. Whatever fetch is doing in the background, it's creating a promise, and it's going out, and we're going to just say goes and gets data from URL that you pass it. And we'll just say, hypothetically, this is fetch. This is not the real fetch. This is just to explain to you guys what fetch is kind of doing. It goes out, it gets the data from the URL. Inside of this promise, this code is happening. And then when it gets the data, it calls resolve with the data that it got. And when it calls resolve with the data that it receives, or whatever code you've got going in here, when you call resolve, that is this guy. That is this data that you call here, that you're passing to resolve, is the data that gets passed into the function that you put into then. Again, if this is confusing to you, do not worry. in reality, this will become more intuitive to you as you practice JavaScript. But in the end, you don't have to necessarily fully understand what's going on under the hood. Just keep it in the back of your head. Think about, like, why is this happening? And you will eventually gain a intuitive understanding of what's happening. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so again, we get this response object from JSON placeholder, that fetch. It returns that promise with a response object. Well, I want to see the actual JSON data. That's inside a body, but that's a readable stream. So in order to get this data as JSON, we need to call the JSON function on this response object. Now, I want you to take a second here to realize that what I'm talking about can sound very confusing at first, and it's fine. Don't worry about it. Watch this video multiple times if you have to. It's okay. Don't feel overwhelmed. But I'm going to go over some stuff that may sound confusing at first, but I think you can wrap your head around it. It's not that difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now remember, I'm calling console.log. I'm logging data.json. Let's see what this logs. See, it logs a promise. So what does that mean? That means that data.json returns a promise. And if you want the data of this promise, what do you have to do? You have to call .then on that promise, right? Calling .then on that promise allows us to run some code when that promise completes. So in other words, data.json is asynchronous. That means that for some reason, calling JSON on this data is asynchronous. So we need to call .then on it because it's a promise, and we need to accept the data that gets passed to it. So remember, we pass a function into then, and this argument, the argument to the function that we pass in, is the data that is resolved. So I'm going to say like parsed data or JSON data that we now have access to inside of this then function. So now I'm going to actually, let's just say console.log JSON data. Now I've got this console.log statement going on out here. I'm going to get rid of that because we don't want to log the promise itself anymore. We just want to log the result of the JSON data. So this is what I'm going to run here. So when I go inside of here, you can see now it's actually logging the parsed JSON data from the web server. So let's take a look here. Let's see what's going on. We're creating a promise from a fetch. So fetch returns a promise, and fetch goes out and gets the data from the URL you pass it and returns a promise that resolves the data that this URL returns. So we are actually taking that promise that this fetch returns and setting it equal to a promise, or a variable called the promise. Then we are calling then on that promise, and we pass a function to then. The data variable that we're calling here is the data that is resolved from that promise, and now we have access to it inside of this function. Then we're calling .json on that data that we're getting from right here, which is an asynchronous action. So we have to call then on it because .json returns a promise. So we're calling .then, and again, we have to pass a function to then, which is this. This function, again, takes the data that is resolved, and all we're doing is logging it. So that is exactly what's happening here. It's kind of weird to like wrap your head around if you're kind of new to JavaScript, but I promise you, if you just understand what I just said right there, you totally will have a better time understanding promises. So that is how promises work in the successful way. Remember, we can also call reject. So if I reconstruct a promise here, we call resolve when the code succeeds, and we call reject when the code fails. So how do we handle the case of reject? Let's create an if statement, and let's just say if 1 is equal to 0. Now we know 1 does not equal 0, so we already know else is going to get called here. But we're still going to just write this. We're going to say if 1 is equal to 0, we're going to call resolve. Resolve. And we're going to say apples. Else, we're going to call reject. We're going to say that the promise has failed, reject, and we're going to call bananas. Okay, so when we call this promise, obviously this is going to fail and call reject because 1 does not equal 0. So how can we handle that? Well, let's go ahead and I'm going to comment this whole stuff out right here. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to set this promise equal to a variable called the promise. So now we have a promise that we know for a fact is going to fail and call reject. So how do we handle that? To handle that, we would call, instead of .then, instead of calling .then, which we know is the code that will run when it succeeds, we will actually call .catch. And again, .catch accepts a function just like then. Catch is exactly the same as then in that way. It takes a function. The parameter that the function will accept is the error object. So we're going to call it error. You can call this anything you want. It does not matter. I'm going to call it error. And I'm going to log this error. And I want to see what it looks like. So I saved it, and now I go back here, and it looks like bananas. So what does that mean to us? What that means is we can create an asynchronous action that can be very complex. And if it happens to pass, we can pass it any data that we want to pass to that callback function, that then function. We can pass it any data we want to that then function. If it fails, however, we can create any object that we want, any sort of data structure that we want, with any sort of error information that we want to provide as to why the promise might have failed, and we can pass it to reject, and now we have access to catch. But the beautiful thing about this is we can handle both cases. We can handle then and catch. We can chain these operators together. Remember, then takes a function, and the data, or whatever you want to call this, I'm going to call it data. The argument here is the data that is called, or that is passed to this function when it succeeds. So in this case, I'm going to call console.log on data. Now we know that this is going to fail because 1 does not equal 0, but let's save this and let's look. So it calls bananas, but let's go back in here and let's actually make this pass. Let's say 1 is equal to 1. Well, that's a true statement. So we know for a fact resolve is going to get called now. So what happens when I save this? Apples. It logs apples. So you kind of understand what's going on here. Let's actually put that in the context of this HTTP request now. Okay, so we have this HTTP request, which is the promise, and it's a fetch. Fetch returns a promise. And we're going to assume that fetch handles both the resolve and the reject case. We're going to make that assumption. So let's go ahead and call the promise with both a then and a catch. And we're going to console.log the data if it's successful. And we're going to console.log the error if it fails. So right now, it's just this fetch function with the URL. And when I save it, it logs the response object just as we would expect. And the status is 200. The HTTP code 200 means it was a success. Now let's go ahead and make this URL something ridiculous that would almost certainly fail. And I save it. Let's see what happens here. When I go in here, it's actually logging on line 5 of script.js. Let's look at line 5. Line 5 is the catch. So that means it's actually inside of the catch now, which means that it has failed. And it's logging the error object because we are taking the whatever reject is giving us and we're logging it. And in this particular case, fetch is giving us a error message and it says type error, failed to fetch. And it's saying, hey, we were unable to get the data that you requested. That is then and catch in the context of the HTTP request. There's a lot more involved with promises, but we can kind of go over that in a little bit more of an intermediate level promise tutorial. I really hope this cleared promises up for you guys to where you can at least start using them and getting an intuitive understanding of how these things work. If you guys have any questions, please leave it in the comment section below and I will try my best to get to that. All right, go ahead and give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.